Let's take a moment and listen. What does it sound like to hear silence? What does it feel like to look at a tradition and not be reflected in it? What does it look like to see leadership that doesn't resemble you? For far too much of our history, women heard silence. We felt excluded and saw leadership that didn't look like us. In Jewish communities, in texts, and in our traditions. This week's parashah, Shemini, is a shining example. In this portion, Aaron's sons, Nadav and Avihu, watch their father perform the intimate and intricate choreography of worshiping God. They see him prepare the altar and sacrifice an animal. They send wreaths of smoke, sweet-smelling smoke up to the heavens, and then they see God's own self come down before them in a pillar of fire and demonstrate delight with their father by consuming his offerings. Perhaps wanting to replicate their father's success and perhaps wanting for God to draw near to them too, these two naive boys then decide to make their own offering. Their choreography and their offering is somehow different from their father's. Eish Zara, strange fire, is what they offer. And the two boys, these two young priests, Nadav and Avihu, are struck dead. While Moses and the rest of the Israelites gathered are allowed to mourn these young men, their father Aaron is silent. Vayidom Aharon, the Torah tells us. Vayidom Aharon. Aaron was silent. This is the kind of silence that comes after a great calamity. The calamity is so huge that Aaron's surviving sons, Itamar and Eleazar, who are named in this passage, also do not speak. Aaron, Nadav, Avihu, Moses, Itamar, and Eleazar, all men. And what of Elisheva? Her silence is so deafening that the Torah doesn't even mention her name. Are you not familiar with that name? Elisheva? She was Aaron's wife. And in this parashah, full of ritual and sacrifice of life and death, she is one of the many women who are not named. Elisheva, mother of two living sons, priests of Israel, and now the mother of two sons struck down by God. Her silence is so complete that many of us don't even know her name. Sitting here now, what does it sound like to you to hear the silence of all the imahot, the matriarchs, the women who lived alongside the men the Torah tells us so much about? What does it feel like to recognize that Torah, the basis of our eternal tradition, is largely stories of heroes and not heroines? What does it look like to see our ancient and not so ancient past as a place starved of women acting and deciding or even speaking? The need for a feminist Judaism begins with hearing silence. We are taught by Judith Plaskow in her landmark 1990 book, Standing Again at Sinai. Silence is exactly what we heard for centuries, for millennia even. It took one woman and then many women dreaming their way into our traditions, into our texts, and into our leadership to end that silence. These visionaries heard and felt and saw possibilities, and they acted to redirect the path of our history. I speak to you tonight from this bima as we mark 3 momentous occasions, each of which took dreaming and acting to achieve. The most recent occasion, the instituting of March as Women's History Month, has reminded us every year for the past 35 years that there are voices that history left out. When we only read the texts left to us by earlier generations, we lose the stories of countless people, more than half of our population. So even if we forget at other moments in the year, this month is an insistent reminder to raise up and amplify and hear women's voices and stories. This month, founded as Women's History Month by the work of scholars and activists like Dr. Gerda Lerner of the University of Wisconsin, this month, this is what it sounds like when we remember to seek out women's voices and let them speak. Feeling left out of tradition was the norm for Jewish girls 100 years ago. But 100 years ago this very week, Judith Kaplan was the first girl that we know of to be called to the Torah as a bat mitzvah. Her father, Rabbi Mordechai Kaplan, the founder of Reconstructionist Judaism, officiated this landmark ceremony, a ritual that had never existed before. Imagine that. Sitting in an institution where 56 bat mitzvah ceremonies have been held in the 29 weeks of the current school year. It's hard to believe that once upon a time, not that long ago, there had been none. But Judith Kaplan and her family were able to take a feeling of exclusion that girls simply expected, and instead they started a revolution. Bat mitzvah, bar mitzvah, bee mitzvah. These are all available to our children thanks to that very first moment of inclusion. In that moment, Judith Kaplan felt like and became a full member of the Jewish community. Halfway between then and now, a young woman from Cleveland, Ohio, looked at the clergy of American Judaism and saw not one woman looking back at her. And somehow, Sally Presand was undeterred. Despite being pushed by her seminary towards Jewish education, even after she had been accepted, Jewish education being a perfectly respectable career for a Jewish girl or woman, Sally saw a future as a rabbi, the first rabbi who looked like her or like me in this country. As an interesting aside, the Reform movement had supported the idea of women becoming rabbis since 1922, the same year that Judith Kaplan became bat mitzvah. But the rabbinical school at Hebrew Union College just refused to accept or ordain women until Sally insisted 50 years later. In going from Sally to Rabbi Presand, she made it possible for other girls and women to see themselves as rabbis. I hope that it's clear that I was able to dream this path and this role for myself because others did it first. I didn't have to hear silence. I got to hear a call. I decided that I wanted to be a rabbi at my bat mitzvah. And if you want to know what that looked like, just check your members' weekly email this weekend or check Central's social media channels to see a somewhat regrettable picture. It was the 90s. A family friend saw me on the bima that evening leading prayers, reading Torah, and delivering a sermon, and said, "Hey kid, you should be a rabbi." She was right. I loved the learning in religious school that unlocked our past and our traditions and made them my own. I loved studying Torah and trope and the meaning of prayer with my cantor. I loved discussing how text related to the world that I lived in with my parents and with my rabbi. But mostly, I loved sharing all that I had learned with my community. The learning and studying and discussing and teaching and sharing. These are all still the things that inspire me and make me excited to be a rabbi every single day. Standing on this bima, reflecting on the life-changing experience of my own bat mitzvah, standing here as your rabbi, I am in awe. I am in awe of the women and the girls before me who dreamed these experiences into reality. They heard and felt and saw themselves as equal members of this Jewish people. Because they did, we can too. Something we have learned over these last 100 years is that women's inclusion and equity in Jewish life and leadership and in the world as a whole, it helps us all move forward. We can trace our community's evolution from a group of male Israelites gathered before Moses and Aaron at the altar, to girls and women becoming bat mitzvah, to the full recognition and embrace of trans, non-binary, and post-gender folks among us as community members, leaders, and clergy. The last 100 years of history demonstrate that we all deserve to hear our own stories, feel included, and see ourselves as full partners in the continuing evolution of our people and its traditions. As a person left out of tradition, how can you begin to hear yourself within it? How can you imagine a community which you feel a full part of? How do you recreate a world that sees you? By dreaming them all into being. It's dreams come true that we celebrate this year, this month, and this night. Shabbat Shalom.